Good evening from me. I know it's not evening for everybody, but good evening from unceded Ngunnawal country. I'm just outside Canberra this evening, so I'd like to pay my respects to Ngunnawal people who've been storytellers here for tens of thousands of years. It's my great pleasure. Did I say my name? I'm Alice Bundy. I'm associate publisher at Brio, and it's my extraordinary pleasure to, I don't really need to hold up the book if I've got the background already. And in fact, the background is eating the book. There we go. It's my extraordinary pleasure to celebrate this evening at the edge of the solid world, which has been a little while coming. I think it was maybe 3 years ago that I first read the manuscript. And I'm not an outwardly very emotional person. I'm normally quite restrained. I'm very Anglo in that way. And I remember sitting at my desk sobbing, reading this manuscript, because from the first pages, it was so powerful and so moving. And I just knew that I wanted to have the opportunity to introduce it to readers. So it's an extraordinary privilege that Daniel has entrusted Brio with publishing this book. We're really proud to publish it. And if I do say so myself, I think we've got a beautiful cover and a very handsome typeset. And the book is available for you all now in all good bookstores. In fact, I'm not sure if Daniel's seen physical copies yet. Have you received those?
I have a physical. I do have a physical copy. Yes, I have multiple physical copies, but I've not seen it in a bookstore, unfortunately. But I have seen photos, which is very nice to see.
The next best thing. I have seen it in 2 states in bookshops. I can confirm that it exists in the world. So it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Anna MacDonald, who'll be doing the honours. Anna MacDonald is a writer and bookseller from Melbourne, and she's reviewed for 3am Sydney Review of Books and ABR, amongst others. And her new book, A Jealous Tide, is also available in good bookstores now. Thank you so much, Anna.
Such a pleasure, Alice. Thank you. So what we thought we were going to do, Daniel, did you want to read a bit first and then to give us a bit of context, or do you want me to ask a big question first? Do you have a preference?
Why don't you go for a question? The first section I'm going to read might need a bit of context. So
sounds good. Well, hopefully this will give some context.
Okay.
So first, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk about this book, At the Edge of the Solid World. I have my physical copy too. And congratulations, Daniel, too, for being listed in the Australian Book Review's Best Books of 2020. So that was perfect timing, I think. Yeah, well to celebrate today. So At the Edge of the Solid World is a properly epic and expansive novel, I think. Certainly it's the book that reaches furthest across different times and different places than any other I've recently read. It seems to me that one way of approaching the book is as a determined act of witness on the part of the narrator. Almost the first words he writes is, "This is what I remember." It's a written testimony of one father's grief and of his experience of a marriage in crisis, but it's also much, much more than that. And if the narrator does come to terms with his own situation, he does it via a deep, imaginative and a properly felt engagement with other grieving fathers, some of whom are historical, like Francis James Child and Abraham Lincoln, who we'll hear about in a moment. Others are invented. And each of these fathers is connected somehow, and often by direct personal experience, to a particular war or other violent historical event. You manage in less than 500 pages to canvass the Bosnian War, Fallujah, the Highland clearances, the civil wars in Lebanon and Syria, the penal system in Van Diemen's Land, and I think the spectre of colonial violence in Australia is there from early on in the novel too. Also the dispossession of the Celts during the Roman invasion of Britain, the American Civil War, the slave trade, the first stages of moving towards nuclear weaponry, the Holocaust, and more. The scope and the ambition of the novel are remarkable. I'm in awe. But what's even more remarkable, magnificently so, is that you're able to pull it off so seamlessly. And until the point in the novel that you're going to read in a little while, which comes from the Abraham Lincoln section, I was thinking quite lazily now, I think, of the different narrative threads as interwoven. It's very easy to reach for kind of words that are just there that are often kind of used these days to describe a novel that has various narratives in it. But I think more and more now of these as kind of folded into and over one another. It's almost as if the narrator has slipped inside the skin of some of the characters that he's imagining at points, and as if all of the events from the Roman invasion to the death of the narrator's child are happening all at once and at the same time. And what I really want to know is how you did it. Where did the book begin and how did you settle upon the narrative structure?
Wow. So the book, where did the book begin? The book began, I've been collecting material. I don't want to say collecting. I've been keeping material, I guess, that I thought I might work with for a long time. So a lot of what's written in here, when there's a specific time stamp for the narrator meeting somebody or some sort of event, mostly those timestamps are pretty accurate. So the earliest material goes back to 2003. That was the first time I visited the Port Arthur historical site and saw the memorial there, although that comes late in the book. That is one of the first events chronologically, and I went back there in 2009, I think, or 2010. Mm-hmm. And then there's a reference, or there's a section of the book where the narrator meets a soldier, a very terribly wounded soldier at the time that the Iraq War is unfolding, particularly in Fallujah. And that large sections of that are a true story. The narrator is convalescing in the north of Scotland. The soldier lives nearby. I mean, that's a pretty accurate setup for something that I did experience at that time. So I guess that would be 2005 or thereabouts. So that material, and then the material afterwards, the first encounters with child and the child ballads, all happened. The way the narrator says it is mostly how it happened for me and at the time that it happened. So it's sort of been sticking with me, bits and pieces for, geez, I feel really old now. Almost 20 years, which is not how I thought of it when I started writing, but sure, yeah, that'd be right. So that's kind of where the stuff of the book begins. The writing itself began also where the writing begins for the narrator, which is around 2015, towards the end of 2015. He says towards the end of the book that one of the things that triggers him to go to do what he does and to recount this story eventually is the picture of a young boy whose name was Alan Kurdi. He was a refugee from Syria who died in the Mediterranean Sea and washed up on a beach in Greece. I'm sure we all remember this particular photograph. And it was around then, I guess, that I did begin writing it. Partly because of that, because when I saw that picture, it felt like the impetus to finally put pen to paper on this thing that I knew was brewing and had that scope that you spoke of. And also because that around that time, I guess just by chance, that's when the kind of, I don't want to say the voice came to me, but I started feeling the rhythms of the book, the way the narrator speaks, the way he puts sentences together, just started sort of coalescing around then. So that's when the book itself actually became the book that it is. And I brought in all this material. It just felt like there was a shape coming that needed this stuff from 2006 and 2003 that I'd been hoping to find a form for so long, and had tried in various shorter forms that didn't work. It kind of finally all came in. So, but you're right to say, I think that I didn't want it to be sort of intertwined where you get like the alternate sort of narratives of one character and then it is, but yeah, I like the way you put it, that it's like the narrator is stepping into the skin of some of these characters. In fact, I think he says something to that effect when he's first discussing a character called Demirovich. He says that it's like I stepped into him and he was like a puppet that I was wearing. And so I thought, I think he didn't say that until quite late in the writing process. But anyway, he says it. And that concept of having like layers, it's more like layers, like or something superimposed on top of something superimposed on top of something superimposed. So that it is unfolding oftentimes simultaneously. Yeah. So that including in the Lincoln chapter, it's the narrator is sort of he's becoming this character, like he's actually transforming into someone in an historical moment at the same time that he is in his own moment, particularly in that character, because actually in that chapter, for instance, because Lincoln, you referred to Abraham Lincoln. The name actually doesn't appear in the book, Abraham Lincoln, except in the title of the section, but he's referred to just as the man at the desk. It's Lincoln at his desk writing the Gettysburg Address, but it's the narrator at his desk. Like he is the man at the desk. Yeah. They're the same person. It's a reconstruction that the narrator is like wearing at the same time as he's wearing all these others. Yeah.
And that one of the things that really struck me was this question of where a person begins and ends, which kept coming back to me kind of again and again and again in different ways. And it came to me, I suppose, through that way of kind of slipping on the skin of another character in the way that the narrator does. But also that question, I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't read the book, but the body is extremely important, I think, in this novel, and a kind of interrogation of, does the body contain the person, or is the person also shaped or only shaped by cultural, social, historical kind of context? Was that something you were thinking about?
Yeah, definitely, from a few different angles. So I think it's interesting because I started writing the book, was really when it was a really terrible time, I think, for people culturally. It was the end of 2015. The Trump campaign was in full swing. This was not going very well, and then we had 2016. I was over here in Britain. We had Brexit, we had Trump, we had shortly after that the Weinstein scandal and Me Too and all of this stuff that for literary people, for people who are reading, a lot, is really foregrounded this question of kind of the ownership of narratives, whose stories belong to whom and who gets to tell those stories. And I was really followed those discussions really closely, and was then and still am really kind of two minds about just about every single point in those discussions. But one of the things that I think I ended up feeling very strongly, partly for very personal reasons, but also just sort of philosophically, is that I don't think a single body a single person's body can own a narrative. I think bodies are intermingled in really complex ways through lots of different agents, social, cultural, and so on, and also physical. So that every story is bound up with other stories and other bodies, and therefore the telling of any story is from the very beginning an ethical compromise. Like it's a dirty act. It's filthy ethically. Particularly if I often think that, like, you know, that the foundation of ethics, like, of our ethics is basically, you know, the kind of Kantian thing that you have to treat other people as ends in themselves, not as means to an end, right? Don't instrumentalize other people. Don't use them for your purposes. They are other people. You have to respect that. But you cannot tell a story using the first person voice without instrumentalizing other people. Like, they are literally supporting figures in your narrative. And it doesn't matter if you are coming from a position of virtue where you are trying to tell the story of someone who doesn't get to tell their stories often, and you're trying to reclaim some age. You are doing something really important and noble, I think, but it's still ethically dirty. Like, you're still violating that principle of treating other people as ends in themselves. Like, you just can't do that in storytelling. It's just not part of it. So it was kind of that was like how I tried to think of this intermingling, right? That we're all so bound up in each other's stories that to tell any one is to kind of tug on a thread of a web that's connected to so many others that they all have to move at the same time. And that they're kind of connected in that way, that you tell one and you're also automatically telling another, even if you don't want to be, you know, and that means, like, being another person in a way. And
there are better ways to write, I suppose. Other people's, like,
there are a million ways, and I mean lots of different writers are doing really innovative things. You know, I think particularly of Alexis Wright, who's doing some amazing stuff with sort of ventriloquism, and versus someone like Dave Eggers, who does probably a more questionable job. And I wanted to try even a different path. Well, so I mean, but I think it's important as well to say that, like, it is a first person narrative, like, quite explicitly, and I actually regard it as it is one person's story who is not telling the stories of other people, but telling the stories of projections of himself that are informed by other people. That's kind of the way I went about it.
Why don't we pull one of the threads and you can read?
Well, okay. So, yes, you very kindly gave me the suggestion that I should read this section from the Lincoln chapter. It's just called Lincoln. Just for a bit of context, there's a device in the book that helps the narrator switch, or that signals that the narrator is going to switch between different places and personas, and that comes from the section on Francis James Child, where there's a discussion of what are called thin places. This is a really old concept, actually, of a place where the fabric between one world and another world kind of runs thin, and you can cross over into another realm. It's like a portal, but where it typically was believed to happen in the Celtic culture that the narrator gets to is where there's water, where water is running hard or fast, like a stream or a pool or something like that. So whenever you see that in the book, that there's water coming, you know something's going to happen. So in this particular section, the narrator is sitting in his house in the Swiss Alps. It's winter, the snow is melting, there's a warm wind. He's sitting in front of a computer watching some funerals of some children unfold in Sydney. He has also just been listening to one of the child ballads called Tam Lin, which takes place in Scotland, and he has recalled an incident at the school that he works at, which leads him to relive Abraham Lincoln's writing of the Gettysburg Address. So all three of those are you'll see, it's all here. The forest outside thrashed in a rush of wind. As the snow on the yew tree melted, I could picture droplets plonking off the needles, but the wind blasted the branches so hard that they flung the runoff at the kitchen window and scattered rain across it. I stood at the table and stretched myself to wakefulness. I bent an arm over my head and pulled on the wrist, shook out both arms and then bent the other and pulled again. On the laptop, I saw the orations had begun. I watched as the cameras watched from a distance that made words indistinct. The mourners formed a scrum of black suits, black dresses and shawls. At length, the mother of one lost child emerged and turned to face the rest. She spoke for some time in a murmur, then concluded and returned to her place in the crowd. When she finished, another parent, a father, took a step forward. He started to speak, tentatively at first, then found his rhythm and went on for a while. At the funeral in the meadow on the edge of winter, the first man to speak spent 2 hours addressing the shivering dignitaries. I understand the impulse. There's a certain cast of mind or an inflection of the heart that leads you to feel you can fill the void of an absence with the quantity of your words. If you can just go on a little longer, say something a little more precisely, make sure you've given consideration to every conceivable detail, maybe you can beguile the world with a spell that negates the reality of your loss. With a hiss, another blast of the gale spattered the window with more rain. I turned aside from the silent orations to watch the droplets trickle down the pane, to watch them drip and huddle along the sill. Even granting the outlandishness of the premise, suspending disbelief in sprites, I often find the abrupt union of Tam Lin and Janet attracting my skepticism. Janet was maybe 16 years old. Why would she willingly offer her virgin body to a strange man, an uncouth savage, a sprite of potential ill will, wholly for his benefit, to comfort him and quell his tears with no thought for her safety or her wants? I can only account for her change of heart by thinking her uniquely receptive to the spirit of Carterhaugh Forest. I remember the way I'd seen the forest when I went there as a younger man. I remember it as a refuge from real life, a zone of pure potential. Anything could happen there. That was the sense it emanated. I remember walking hand in hand with Hannah, 2 innocents skirting a stand of hawthorn, and how easily we'd glided into a more serious state. Glided, yes, as if drawn deeper into the air of a place where possibilities grew as readily as any thicket of trees. The dog days of summer, balmy in the sun, cooler by several degrees in the shade. The sweet smell of hazel, the whisper of birch in a breeze. Squirrels scurried after conkers on the forest floor. Hannah wore a pale green shift and a dark green shrug, let her long hair hang loose across her shoulders. Sunshine fell upon her like gold, cascading through the leaves. There wasn't another soul in sight. Anything could happen in a place like that. You could fall into someone's arms. You could do it because you've been hungering for it or just because it felt right at the time. You could withdraw into the trees and free yourself from the turmoil around them. You could cast off a life you felt pressured to flee and fly towards a place that held the promise of a new one. My cheeks burned with heat as the wind hit my face, flushed cool as the gale pelted me with water. I'd opened our back door to the forest, swiping aside my reflection to step into the wild night. I'd watched Demirovich speak and finish speaking in a matter of minutes. Cameras captured him from a distance, though their microphones were too weak to make anything audible but the waves. On the screen, Demirovich mouthed silent words at his daughter's graveside. He read from prepared marks that drooped in his hands. The other mourners gathered round to listen to things outsiders would never hear. Hardly had he begun before he stepped aside. He folded up his notes and slipped the paper into a trouser pocket. With every move he made, he became the embodiment of an echo, the echo of the meadow and the man who struggled to summon his words at the ceremony there. The man himself had grown careworn and churlish. Colleagues told him he looked ghastly, as much a cadaver as the boys he'd commemorate. He'd seen himself in the glass of the lithograph, in the window of the train, in the lenses of his spectacles, and he couldn't deny his decline. In the end, though, he'd hailed up the strength to speak. To what purpose? 2 or 3 minutes of waffling, nothing of any real substance. Neither he nor anyone else could charm the world with hallowed words, he said. Nothing spoken there could possibly add to or detract from the brute significance of the lives now interred in the soil. He said these things in a voice drawn thin, reading aloud from hasty notes as he yielded his mind to thoughts unhitched from the saying. In contemplating the grieving parents, he'd thought on the hopes they must have once held. How many unknowable wishes had been obliterated with those bodies? He'd thought on the hopes that he and his wife had held for their own son, all of them lost when typhoid took hold. Nothing ambitious, a respectable life, a useful trade, a liberal education, that he might know his forebears, that he might find someone to love. All of it gone. And where had it begun? Where had it all come from to be invested in that body? A hand on a rounded belly, the tenderness of skin to skin, the intimacy of such moments, the kicking the man could sometimes feel, the way he held his touch as if by force of will he could muster up all his dreams for the unborn child and release them through his palm, supercharging the life to come with as much potential as he could envisage. Didn't every parent do that? Wittingly or not, willfully or not, when all those men, those smothered boys, were yet to become part of the world, hadn't their parents done the same? Skin to skin, full of hope. All that hope, the whole almighty reservoir of it, now just another casualty of war. And words, what use was a word when you had a body to contend with? What power could words ever hold in the presence of so many bodies?
Oh, there's so much to unpack just in those couple of pages, Daniel. I'm trying to think of what to focus on. I guess one of the things that really struck me and which I really loved about the novel is the way you allow every character to be properly human and complexly human. Demirovich and the other parents in that section are burying their children as a result of a kind of horrific act of violence. But still you, or the narrator, attempts to understand what the motivation for that violence might be. There's a wonderful phrase where he uses something like the subterranean why. And it seems to me that this sense of trying to understand this thing that storytelling can do is also completely at odds with the way that we so often get stories these days, which is also captured in that passage, and that's via media, constant kind of online updates, constant kind of refresh, and just a kind of grasping, greedy kind of attempt to get as much kind of as much footage, as many clicks as possible. Was that a conscious decision to kind of fight against that way of absorbing information?
Yeah, definitely. You know, that it's a real kind of epistemological problem that I hate. That the kind of, I'm interested in the way that people come to formulate the judgments they formulate about other people, about any kind of situation. How do they gather the information that lends itself to a particular judgment? And one of the things, and that's something that I have been writing about for more than a decade now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's consistent across all the areas that I've looked into with this problem is that haste and expedience almost always lead to really bad stories,
Yeah.
really bad. And when I say stories, I mean like an explanation of cause and effect. Why did some person do this? Oh, it's because X, Y, Z. And the way that social media in particular, but well, no, I was, well, yes, social media today, but also social media from decades past. I'm thinking of things like talk radio, which has been around forever, but it's another form of social media, right? Like it's Twitter on air. The way that the haste and the expedience comes out is sort of like, well, what, why did somebody do something? Oh, it's because they are this type of person. This is the person that they are. It's not because of, certain factors. It's because there's something innate to that person that made them do this thing. And the follow on from that for listeners or for readers or whatever is because they are that type of person and I am not that type of person, I am not capable of what they have just done. And I personally profoundly disagree with that. And I think the narrator clearly disagrees with that as well. And part of the conscious, like the thought process of, like in making this a conscious thing was that when people are reading literature, particularly literary fiction, they often tell themselves the opposite story about themselves, right? So we have this kind of assumption that literary fiction it's a humanist thing. It's a humanist discipline in the academy. It's in the humanities. We say it has a humanizing influence. And in saying that, we're going way, way back to a really, really ancient tradition. Like it was the Roman poet Terence who kind of formulated humanism, with the idea that because I'm human, nothing human is alien to me. I can understand anything human. And so the way it plays out in literary fiction is often, somebody tells their story, they tell it in detail. It's an experience very different from mine. It might be quite a harrowing experience, but that I have no connection to. But if they tell it in sufficient detail, I have the capacity to empathize with that and sympathize with that. And I can understand their story because nothing human is alien to me. It's all, I have that capability of understanding, which I think is true. But I also think that the opposite is true, which is if you're thinking of the very worst that people can do, that is also a human capacity. And I think that's in all of us, actually. I think that's that what separates any of us from anyone we might condemn because they're that sort of person is just luck. It's nothing innate. It's luck of genetics. It's luck of birth circumstance. It's luck of any number of factors of luck, but that is all it is. And that the very worst that we as a species are capable of is there in every single one of us. So the thought process was kind of, okay, if you go the hasty route and you condemn people for what they do because they're a different type of person, that's plainly wrong. But if you go the leisurely route and you say, you kind of say, well, sufficient understanding of certain types of people is within me, then that's only half the story. And because it's only half, it's a bit of a falsehood, or it's a bit of a lie for me. It's a bit of a self-delusion. So I wanted to kind of still work within humanism, but open up that second half of it, and that takes real leisure and space and whatever the opposite of haste is, a real extending the principle of charity and goodwill to actually understand what it is that has led someone to do something, and to not, as the narrator puts it, to not ask why or who is this person, why did they do this, in a rhetorical sense, like just to answer the hasty narrative, but to really ask why, like, who is this, what have they gone through, why did this happen, and how far differently would I act if I had been in exactly the same circumstances. I don't think it's that far differently at all for most of us.
There's I'll come to another reading in a moment, but I just want to ask one more question before then. Is that okay? And for those of you who are listening, when Danielle and I were kind of working out how we'd do this, I said, I'll ask one big question at the beginning and then we can unpack things. And I realized when I was sitting down to get ready for this evening that, in fact, all my questions are big. And I think that's because the book demands that of us too, that we properly interrogate what we're capable of, as well as what the characters who are represented here, you know, their motivations and so on. So brace yourself for another big question. So while I was reading At the Edge of the Solid World, I found myself thinking quite a lot about W.G. Sebald. I'm not sure if he was a direct influence, and there are definitely important ways that I think this novel is quite different from his prose narratives, but there are also commonalities, including, I think, a consideration of the difficulties and the responsibilities associated with both representation and memorialisation. And I'm thinking especially, I suppose, of the Port Arthur chapter in terms of the kind of complications of memorialising an event. And in one of his essays, An Attempt at Restitution, Sebald poses the question, what is literature good for? And he says, or he writes, perhaps only to help us to remember and teach us to understand that some strange connections cannot be explained by a causal logic. And I'm wondering what you think literature is good for.
I think that first of all, that the Sebald essay, in particularly the line about restitution, is something that I've has stuck with me for a very long time, at least 10 years. I think it's a really powerful essay. It's the natural history of destruction, right? That appears in, I think, somewhere. So I would agree with that, but I would agree that that's part of what it's good for. But for me, there's a more primal question that's really different from anything that Sebald would say, maybe even totally at odds with anything that Sebald would say. And it's this. At bottom, I'm kind of an existentialist, right? I have a very limited lifespan. I don't know when I'm going to die. And so I have to think really, really carefully about how I'm going to use my time.
Yeah.
And I don't think that reading a work of literature, for me, that the possibility of that sort of restitution is enough to earn it the time and attention it would take from me. I guess I'm kind of solipsistic and selfish in that way. That there's really only one thing. I mean, it's nice if I can get that from it, but that's not the reason to start and to continue. Nor is the reason to start and continue something like, you know, reading a novel that says something about our times. Like, I hope my book does that, but I don't think that's enough reason for anyone really to pick it up and keep reading. I wouldn't wish that upon them. So for me, the only thing that has that force to propel me to give my time to it is the experience itself, is the aesthetic experience of reading. Like that's for anything I read, really, unless I'm seeking to be informed about a particular issue, and then I'm really into nonfiction. But for fiction and literary essays, it is about aesthetics for me, and that means that I'm going to give it a quantity of my time, in this case quite a large quantity of my time, and in the time that I'm giving it, it has to be taking me through a certain experience of sensibility. It can be anything. Like, what that experience is anything, but it has to be controlled and articulated over a length of pages that equals this block of time, so that I can look back on it that way. And I hope that was my first intention in writing the book. Yeah, that was the first thing and the ultimate thing. And then all the other stuff, the emotional journey and the commentary is important, I think, really important, but not primary. It comes in as a secondary thing or an ancillary thing to the aesthetic experience that I hope the book is giving the reader, as I hope any book is going to give to me when I read.
Certainly, I would struggle to think of any other novel, I was trying to think, that has a similar kind of aesthetic effect. So, yeah, I think tick, yeah.
Thank you.
So, yes, we each have a limited lifespan, and we don't know how long that will be, and we have to use our time wisely. But we have an afterlife of sorts, which is perhaps a good time to kind of move into your next reading, do you think?
That was a lovely segue into this. Yes. So this section comes from, it's a very different section of the book. The setup is that the narrator, he works at a school. He has done something to offend some students at the school. He has to speak to them about what he's done to offend them. And in the course of that, he meets a student who connects him with an actual artifact from a real man, Enrico Fermi, who I think is really underknown. And Fermi was one of the most incredible figures of the 20th century. He's essentially the man who developed the atomic bomb, among other things, the calculations that went into the Manhattan Project. He was the mathematical brains behind it. But he was an Italian man, married to, well, he was married to an Italian woman, but she was Jewish and their children were Jewish. And as the anti-Semitic laws in Italy came into effect in the 30s, they fled. And their opportunity to flee was that he was invited to Stockholm to win the Nobel Prize. This was before he did anything on the bomb, Nobel Prize in physics. So they fled, and then they fled to America. So this is a section where one of the students tells the narrator about this man and about a real thing, that kind of calculations that this man, Enrico Fermi, is now known for. Enrico Fermi, in my mind, sat in silence on the snowbound train and watched his reflection grow almost solid as the darkness deepened beyond the window. In Göttingen, Jakob had told me Fermi had made his reputation thanks to an intellectual party trick. He had an uncanny ability to derive orders of magnitude from minimal data and inferential calculations. He perfected it throughout his life, much to the awe of others, running the maths in his mind to demonstrate astonishing things. The approximate number of piano tuners in a city the size of Chicago, the approximate volume of all the pebbles on the bed of Lake Michigan. And famously, this fact: anytime anyone draws a single breath anywhere on the planet, there's a probability of 99% that they'll inhale at least one molecule of the air expelled by Julius Caesar in his final gasp, as the conspirators closed in and Brutus brandished his blade. Jakob tried to gauge my response with wide-eyed enthusiasm. Did you know this? Sounds pretty fanciful. It does, yes, but the numbers don't lie. My grasp on the numbers was infantile. One man, one breath, recycled through the millennia, revived, reinvigorated, even now, even today, in billions of other bodies. That's as much as I could hold in my head. Actually, said Jakob, the mathematics is quite simple. You begin with the lung capacity of an average adult male. From that, you calculate the number of molecules he would inhale. Easy. Then you calculate how long it would take for those molecules exhaled to return to the atmosphere with an even distribution. Without a sense of the actual figures, I worried I'd be lost. If the atmosphere contains X molecules of air, he said, and of these a given man exhaled Y molecules, then the probability that I will inhale... No, I said, sorry, just wait. With a heave, I struggled up from the sofa and retreated to the window. Wait, I said, just wait, giving instructions even as I turned my back on the students. At the window, I'd let out a sigh, looking across the valley to the Wetterhorn, and I closed my eyes to concentrate on what Jakob was trying to tell me. Run it by me again, I said, slowly. So he did. He obliged me. An inhalation, an admixture of molecules, oxygen and nitrogen drawn into the trachea of a tyrant, charging through the bronchioles into the alveoli, then discharged into the blood flow about to be ended. My thoughts snagged on the tip of the knife between the ribs, the puncture of a lung, the splutter, the spittle, the fading warmth of a dying gasp stolen away by a breeze. My thoughts swept up that breath on the phone, buffeting its elements across the Tuscan hills and over the sprawl of the Padan plain and up up into Ticino through the warren of the passes, to fall upon the sides of the mountains I could see when I opened my eyes again. When I turned from the view of the valley to face the students again, to find them already watching me, my thoughts, I realized, had outrun my awareness and made the students appear to me as other than themselves. In them now I saw something I'm sure Fermi meant for his words to reveal, to prompt his one-time friend and colleague to see. Gone were the people in that room, gone as well, their names, their expressions, all their surface features, leaving before me only miasma, a host of hazes as of chemical fumes, assuming vaguely human dimensions. What was this stuff, the stuff of their being? Volume without mass, matter without bonds or compounds, but instead something like sediment, like a granular residuum, churned up to drift and twirl through the vacuum spaces of organs and tissues and veins invisible to me. If there was any truth to Fermi's words, with our living breath we return life to Caesar, then I reasoned that truth had to hold up exponentially as well. Why stop one's thoughts at the breath of one man? In the course of a single day, we'd breathe in the breath of every person who ever lived and who had in their time inhaled the breaths of all who'd come before them. We'd also breathe in more of the stuff of life in molecules born on the air. Tears once shed would evaporate. Blood once spilled would coagulate. Flesh would decay and then dissipate, and so I saw just to be, to live and survive, to eat and drink, to breathe in, breathe out, would be constantly to take into one's body the particulate remnants of all the dead. It would be to accept them, to hold them, to expel them, and then accept others, to incorporate them, to carry them inside oneself.
So this image completely floored me. I had never heard about breathing in, that I was every day breathing in some of Caesar's last breath.
Everyone's.
and everyone else's. I'm happier about some than others, I have to say. And there's this sense, so we've got this image that we're all of us still are breathing the particles of Caesar's last breath. And it becomes, I think, increasingly important as the novel progresses from this point. There's a beautiful kind of, I think, connected topographical realization of this kind of idea too, right at the end of the novel, where the narrator imagines a kind of topographical umbilical cord connecting the Middle East, the Alps, Scotland, all of these places that are kind of key to the narrative. Mm-hmm. So we all breathe the same air, we all live on the same earth, we're all connected in this way, but also genuine connection is complicated. And the novel opens with two epigraphs, one from Virginia Woolf about the illusion of a common language, the difficulty of knowing and understanding ourselves, let alone anybody else. And one from John Berger about the role of imagination and stories and how they play to help us make sense of those events which Berger says outstrip over our vocabulary. And that kind of juxtaposition, you know, when I got to the end and I remembered the beginning, I thought, is that connection of breath and earth a meaningful one? Can we have it both ways? Can we be connected in this way and also struggle to connect on a more kind of emotional or cerebral kind of way?
Yes. Yes, we can have it both ways. Yes, that's, I mean, that's kind of, I think perhaps the Virginia Woolf epigraph illustrates that, maybe in a better sense than the Berger one. The idea is that the narrator is having this experience which the experience of the loss of a child, which his double bind is that he wants to manage this experience. He wants this to not completely rupture his life, his sense of self. And in that sense, he goes looking for perhaps models of people who have been through a similar experience. He is searching them out. So doing the wolf thing of looking for someone who has had the same experience that I might have had. At the same time, he doesn't want that, because if the experience is not entirely unique to him, then it loses some of its preciousness. And he thinks this has implications for how much love he felt for his child. But so I think the Berger epigraph is about, like, how can I communicate this experience? Yeah, I can't. I don't have the words for this experience. Like, the language doesn't have the words for this experience. The whole body of the English language doesn't have it. So I have to tell a story in order to convey something that is lacking a word. Okay, what story do I tell? And so that's when he goes off and he searches for these other stories, all of these men who have something that they can give the language to convey something about his experience. So that is having it both ways, right? At the end of the day, there's nobody except the narrator. Like, it is his story, it is his voice, and all of the others are projections or constructions of him, or reconstructions, or they're not commensurate with the actual historical figures or even the actual contemporary figures, because he has such a partial view of them. They are him. But the parts that he's drawing from those stories in order to find the language that Berger is asking us to find are connections. They are those connections. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of splitting the difference in a way. I think I and the narrator would not entirely agree with either Woolf or Berger, and end up, yes, as you pointed out, in a different place, maybe somewhere that's kind of triangulating a little bit. Yeah.
That was my last question. So I don't know if there's questions. If Alice wanted to take. That was fabulous, Daniel, too, by the way.
Thank you. Those were great questions.
I've got more. Yeah.
We only have a few more minutes, but I just wanted to butt in with a couple of comments of my own, if you'll forgive me. Number one is, I'm going to paraphrase Karen Goldsworthy here, where she says that your book is unusual in that the story and the writing are of equal sophistication and are executed equally beautifully, and I agree with that. It is, as you've sort of hinted, and as the size of the book would suggest, quite long. But for a reader, it certainly, for me, it certainly didn't feel long, because there's this kind of compulsive quality to the prose, and certainly a rhythm, which one doesn't generally expect in novels these days, I think. And so the rhythm of the book is really powerful. And I hadn't thought of the books explicitly in terms of existentialism. I think I'm also at heart an existentialist, so that's another reason why I liked it. One thing I wanted to pick up on from the first question was about the folding of the stories on top of each other. And the original title for the book, which is good from a sort of artistic perspective, but not as good from a market perspective, it was Winter Fugue. And so there was this idea of the sort of fugal nature. And so with the poetry and the rhythms of the prose, and then the idea of a fugue, I mean, are you musical, Daniel, or is it
Oh God, no.
Poetry angle?
No, and I was really grateful that Anna didn't ask me to read one of the sections that had song lyrics, because then there would have just been a mass exodus as I started singing.
Maybe
no, not musical.
500 pages. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right. I think yes, it was originally called Winter Fugue. There are a couple of reasons for that, but one is that that was one of the form of the fugue. So the form of in music, the form of the fugue is you have one voice at the start that states a theme. That's usually how it's put. One voice sings something, and then you have other voices that provide variations on this one thing, and they do intertwine, but they also kind of overlap at points. So there's sometimes singing at the same time and sometimes not singing at the same time. So that was a guiding metaphor for structuring the book. But I think ultimately it kind of comes away from that metaphor in the multi-layering and the thing that a musical fugue can't really do, which is that the book, when you'll have 3 or 4 layers of narrative that are then pointing backwards in time and actually taking you back to something that you've been through already, maybe from a different perspective, and then coming back. And I'm not sure, I would say that's probably not possible in music. The other thing, can I just say the other thing, that Winter Fugue was sort of a little bit of a jokey title, or an in-jokey title, or something more personal. There's a really lovely story called Spring Fugue by Harold Broadkey, which is about virtually nothing. It's an afternoon in the life of a couple. The wife goes to work and the husband is at home and he's preparing dinner and he cuts his thumb. He slices his thumb and he has to go to the hospital too. That's all it is. But it's the start of spring and he's in sort of this fugue state. Like, that's the idea. But that too provided something, like just wanting to write something like that provided something to this book, even though that's a short story, like 5 pages compared to this, because the way he does it is he says something like, when he cuts his thumb, he says, I was slicing a tomato, and I was slicing an Israeli tomato and thinking of Super Tuesday 2 years ago, and that's when I did it. And I just thought, yes, that's it. Like, that's the thing, is like, so often in narratives of marital discord or whatever, it's a very domestic narrative, right? And all that kind of acrimony is about what happens between the husband and wife within their 4 walls. But I don't think that's really how things work in life. I don't think the narrator does either. Like, my mood is so strongly conditioned by what I'm thinking about, which could be anything from history, from the news, from just my mind drifting. Like, that affects how I feel at any one moment, and then how I'm going to respond to anything that comes in front of me. And I just really like that randomness that Broadkey throws in a really quiet moment. So this book is, yeah, you'll see there's lots of drinking tea and just making toast, and people are really angry at each other because of what they've seen on the news or just overheard or something like that, and that has repercussions for their relationships, And I think, I don't know, to me that's kind of how it works. So I like that Broadkey did it, and that was also part of the title thing.
Yeah,
an homage to Harold Broadkey.
And arguably more so now than it has been in the past, because of the way that our phones bring all kinds of news into our hands, into our heads throughout the day.
Yeah. And distinct and personalised. Like, you're not on the same page. Like, you're clearly not on the same page as the person sitting next to you anymore, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
And somehow some marriages survive, at least. Anna, thank you so much for beautiful hosting and excellent questions.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, everyone who's popped in there. It's great. It's great to see you both. Thank you.
The good news is that we've recorded this, and with everyone's permission, we'll put it up for more people to be able to have a look at. I'm really very thrilled with this book, and that it's getting into the hands of readers and reviewers who are seeing the same sorts of extraordinary things in it that first inspired me. So congratulations, Daniel, on this. I mean, I feel as though it's evident from reading the book that it has been a huge amount of thinking and ethical wrangling and care at the word level, at the sentence level, at the paragraph, at the page, at every single level. There's been a great deal of care, and I think the reader can see that. So congratulations. Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and makes an excellent Christmas present, I can tell you. Not for everybody.
Not for everybody.
But for the clever person in your in your network, I think they'll enjoy talking about it with you afterwards. Thank you all, and have a good evening / morning / day.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Anna.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Bye.
Ciao.